spaces, which, rather than broader public space, and this really isn't the case. Disabled people are out and about using public space every day. And so with this in mind, we do need to shift to a social model worldview, which views the built environment rather than the person as in need of transformation. We shouldn't be forcing disabled people to adapt to our designs. And we need to focus on fixing the issues we have ingrained in our public spaces rather than the people who use them. This is critical now more than ever because there are over 1 billion disabled people globally, and this is as of 2011. So this number is likely much higher today, and it continues to rise with general population growth as well as aging population growth. This is 1 out of 7 people in the world identifying with some sort of disability, and 1 in 4 to 1 in 5, or roughly a quarter of the United States population with a disability. So this is no small number of people. Disability is a very broad spectrum, and it ranges from physical to sensory to neurocognitive and psychological disabilities. Many folks do identify with more than one disability across this spectrum, and I do want to note that this graphic is in no way conclusive of all disabled identities. Many of these disabilities are invisible or not easily detectable with a general glance. Some disabled folks use visible devices like wheelchairs or hearing aids, while others use none. So disability is not always easy to identify or understand, but the disabled community is the most diverse and intersectional group of people on the planet, and it is a community that anyone might join at any time. So we really do need to account for this rich variance in our designs as much as possible, and not assume that only one type of disabled person is using a space at any given time. This is one of the toolkits on my website. And usually our design process is pretty standardized, right? We start with site analysis and we end with construction. But my question is, where does the disabled community come in? And the problem is they often don't. And so here I illustrate ways designers can begin to bring disabled stakeholders and experts into the design process, because lived experience is truly a form of expertise. And there are also disabled experts and designers, such as myself, that not only have the disabled experience, but also professional experience in design and related fields. And so the biggest issue is that designers rely more so on assumption than on direct feedback. And we need to be more willing to grow and holistically apply knowledge accumulated through the process. In addition to creating a more inclusive design process, I provide guidance on how to design with and for disabled people. This methodology is very qualitative in nature. We start with the ADA standards and any state codes as the foundation or the baseline to build upon. The next step is to creatively input universal design or other principles of design, such as depth space as an adaptive tool. And then the final step is to bring in that disabled stakeholder and expert feedback accumulated during the design process as a qualitative control. So here in Rome, my question has been literally and figuratively, what does access look like in the Eternal City? My projects seek to creatively investigate and document accessible and aesthetic imaginaries in Roman landscapes. So here in Rome, I came with the general knowledge that it was not built for disabled people, which is quite obvious. Of course, definitions of disability have shifted over the centuries, but in ancient Rome, surviving with a disability was a privilege that likely very few enjoyed. Most disabled children and adults who were not wealthy were killed, either by being thrown off of cliffs into the Tiber River or merely left out to starve and die. So these actions were even mandated by the 12 tables in the 5th century BC, which enforced parents to kill their disabled children to the benefit of Roman society. Babies born with defects or disabilities were thought of as bad omens. So although slaves were sometimes valued for disability for some reason or another, many were also forced to serve as fodder for entertainment in the Colosseum, and deaf people who may have survived were not allowed to participate in public life. So how do we even begin to think about access with this dire history? Despite tourism and architecture's barriers, disabled people continue to travel to Rome to connect deeply to its landscapes, architecture, and history. Somehow, despite our differences, historic landscapes have the power to bring us together. And so my starting question was really about the essence of Rome. How can we reimagine historic preservation and discover opportunities where things are going right? I could be necessarily yet extremely critical of spaces as an accessibility specialist, and so I deliberately did come into this project thinking about the positive spaces I encounter. And in order to do this work, we need to accept that Rome is in fact not sacred. It is not untouchable, uneditable, or unchangeable. In fact, Rome has constantly evolved and layered and built over itself, and as Emily shared with us, it has stolen from other cities and cultures to form its own identity, and it continues to be rewritten. So, in my opinion, Rome is a layer cake. Each architectural era itself is a layer of the eternal city, and accessibility can and should be treated as just another layer of richness that is Rome. Creatively reimagining requires looking at what already exists. How can disabled people already move through Roman landscapes? Not all of these existing spaces are perfect, nor are they up to code, but we can see where they begin. When we think of historic preservation, we often see it as the antithesis of accessibility or vice versa, but the landscape has been changing constantly to adapt to needs and desires for space. For example, access to the Tiber River was created when the issue of flooding was addressed in the 1800s. Access can be created in delicate ways that do not damage the ground plane. Access can be created in tight spaces. Access can be implemented in standardized ways that provide safety and wayfinding. Access can even be found in Pompeii, where stones were used for people to cross over flooded streets. Even the fascists have done it once or twice. Our neighbors have done it at the Spanish Academy, the American University, and the Orto Botanico. The Academy has begun to think about accessibility now more than ever, and I look forward to witnessing the continuation of this process. But here, my focus in Rome has not been on physical access, which Rome needs to reckon with much more, but with the deaf experience. I have focused my time on 3 projects which reframe, reimagine, and retell experiences of deafness in the Eternal City, and I'm going to dive deeper into each of these. I first want to illustrate that deafness is also a very large spectrum, so you may have noticed I'm using my voice today. I do identify as deaf, but I'm what we call late deafened, and I'm a predominantly speaking deaf person who uses a combination of spoken English, captioning, and American Sign Language. I was 8 years old when I started to become deaf, and I actually attended mainstream school my entire life without ASL, and so I started claiming my identity as a culturally deaf person with a capital D after I started learning ASL about 5 years ago. And so I do want to stress that I'm only a snippet of what deaf identity means, and my experience informs my practice alongside other deaf and disabled experiences. And so my first project is personal in nature, and it seeks to reframe the narrative of anatomical votive offerings from one of obtaining a cure or healing to one of gratitude and pride in deaf and disabled identity. I'm not an antiquarian, but I've always been intrigued by votives. They are body parts molded by hand and often pierced for suspension by cord or nail, and then usually mounted on packs or directly on temple walls. They were in use as early as the Middle Minoan period, which was 2000 to 1650 BC, and they were made of clay then. Here at the Academy Archaeological Archives, there is a small collection of terracotta votives of various body parts, which you see here, a bit of those. Little is known about them, but they likely came from southern Etruria and Latium during the late Republican period, which was about the 4th to the 1st centuries BC, and Roman Gaul in the mid-1st century BC onwards. Votives were actually made of wood, metal, and stone, and then in Roman Lydia and Phrygia in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, they were stone stelae with complex personal narratives to the gods. And then throughout Christianity, there have also been votives in churches and pilgrimage sites such as Lourdes. I was excited to find one ear in the archival collection. Although there are possibilities that these votives were used for other purposes, they are primarily known as offerings to the gods or healing deities asking for healing or cure of the body part represented by the votive. Sickness, disease, and disability were often rationalized as punishment by the gods, and it was believed fragimenting the body into votives played a direct role in the curing of sick or disabled bodies. Growing up as a deaf child, I was constantly told by society that I needed to fix or cure myself to adapt to everyone else. Disabled people experience this every day of our lives. In defiance, I created 21 votives of ears to represent 21 years of deaf gain. I was 8 years old when I started to become deaf, yet didn't begin to embrace my identity and claim and join deaf culture until I was 22. So this was a direct result of ableism and the medical model worldview, which for many years made me unable to accept my disability as part of who I am. Here I proudly claim my deafness in my community, and I practice gratitude for what it has brought to my life and my unique experiences in Rome and at the Academy. My second project and larger project is a reimagining of landscapes, public parks, gardens, and piazzas in the Eternal City through the lens of Deafscape. Deafspace is a concept of design created by Gallaudet University's deaf community, which is the only deaf university in the world. The Deafspace design guidelines include many principles to design spaces where deaf and hard-of-hearing people can not only access but flourish. There are 5 main sections which highlight the importance of providing deaf folks a 360-degree sensory reach or understanding around the body, and also enough visibility and space to communicate. Because Deafspace is predominantly focused on building interiors, I decided to take the first 4 sections of the guidelines and discover how we can apply them to landscape architecture and urban design, which I called Deafscape. In 2018, I published my article, Deafscape, in Ground Up Journal issue 7, which included an accompanying graphic that focused on 8 Deafscape principles taken from those first 4 sections of the guidelines. These are meant to go beyond ADA requirements to create even more space for the deaf community to enjoy, as well as other disabled and non-disabled folks alike. They are generally really good practices that are not fully incorporated into urban environments, and so for this project, I've reimagined Deafscape in the Eternal City by considering these 8 principles, plus more mentioned in the article. I visited and documented 30 sites using photographs and digital sketching. Most of these are very public parks, gardens, and piazzas in Rome. Many were originally private villas that were acquired as public space. And then there are a couple sites in Florence, Viterbo, and Tivoli. This is not a conclusive study, it is a sampling. I did not focus on physical access in this project. I focused on principles of design present and beneficial for the deaf community. And these spaces, of course, were also not intentionally designed to be deaf spaces, but I will describe each of these principles and share some of the sketches, which are also pinned up in my studio if anybody would like to see them in progress. So the first principle is a tactile cue, or a textured transition, and these provide tangible material cues between the sidewalk, planting areas, and the street to enhance safety, especially for blind and deafblind people. This is not an application of truncated domes or the yellow bumped surfaces that we see at crosswalks in the United States. This is a more subtle and non-code related principle. In many parks and gardens, I saw an application such as this, with stones along the edges of pathways, which would be very detectable by canes, such as here at Villa Aldo Branzini, also here at Villa Sciarra, and I'll describe the other Deafspace principles as I go through the presentation. Villa Borghese illustrates a subtler example. The original cobbles remain at the edges of the newer asphalt. I think this is something many cities can do to keep some of the integrity